Today, we're going to dive into the pivotal opening years of World War II. We're going to see how a series of calculated gambles and absolutely devastating attacks turned a European conflict into a global firestorm, and really set the stage for the world we live in right now. You've probably heard those powerful words before. That's President Franklin Roosevelt speaking to Congress, capturing the shock and resolve of an entire nation. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor is what finally pulled America into the war, but the story doesn't start there, not even close. To really get what this moment meant, we need to rewind, all the way back to the beginning of the war in Europe. So here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start with Germany's shocking blitzkrieg. Then we'll see how Britain stood alone against the storm. We'll watch the war explode onto the global stage, see how the Grand Alliance came together, and finally, pinpoint the critical moments when the tide of the war began to turn. Okay, let's start at the beginning. It's September 1939. Hitler invades Poland, and in doing so, he unleashes a military strategy so fast, so ferocious, that it left all of Europe just completely stunned. They called it Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. And that's exactly what it was. This wasn't about slow, grinding battles. No, this was a terrifying new symphony of speed and overwhelming force. You had fast-moving armored columns, the famous panzer divisions, backed by a relentless air force, just punching holes right through the enemy lines. The whole point was to create chaos and paralysis, and the effect? It was devastating. Poland was conquered in just 4 weeks. So how did it work? Well, you can think of it as a three-punch combo. First, the Panzer tanks smash the hole. Then, right behind them, Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, comes in from above, providing cover and terrorizing anyone who might think of fighting back. And only then, once the chaos is complete, do the regular infantry soldiers move in to secure the territory. It was a brutal and brutally effective formula for conquest. And we saw the pure genius of this strategy during the invasion of France. See, the French had spent a fortune building the Maginot Line, this massive, static wall of fortifications. They were dug in, ready for a head-on fight. But Germany just went around it. They pushed their tanks through the dense Ardennes forest, a move the Allies thought was completely impossible. This brilliant maneuver trapped hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk, and what happened next was one of the most incredible rescues in military history. Over 338,000 soldiers were evacuated, not just by the Royal Navy, but by a whole fleet of civilian boats. We're talking fishing boats, yachts, anything that could float. It was this amazing moment of civilian courage in the middle of a total disaster. So, with France defeated, Hitler was the master of most of Western and Central Europe. Just one major opponent stood in his path: Great Britain. Now, Hitler knew he couldn't invade Britain by sea unless he controlled the skies. This set the stage for the Battle of Britain. At first, Germany targeted British airfields and factories, but the British had a secret weapon: radar. It gave them early warnings, allowing them to scramble their fighters and meet the attacks. Then Hitler made a fatal mistake. Frustrated, he shifted his strategy to bombing cities like London, trying to break civilian morale. This terror campaign, known as the Blitz, was horrific, but it gave the Royal Air Force just enough breathing room to rebuild, inflict huge losses on the Luftwaffe, and force Hitler to call off the invasion. You might be asking yourself, so where was the United States in all this? Well, officially, they were neutral. The policy was called isolationism. America was still recovering from the Great Depression, and the memory of World War I was fresh. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European war. President Roosevelt could see the danger, but laws like the Neutrality Acts tied his hands. But that neutrality, it wasn't going to last. Two monumental decisions, one made by Hitler in Europe and another by Japan in the Pacific, were about to turn this war into a true global catastrophe. The first one was Hitler's. You see, back in 1939, he'd signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin and the Soviet Union to keep his Eastern Front safe. But in June 1941, he made a colossal blunder. He betrayed Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, all-out invasion of the USSR. Hitler gambled that if he could crush the Soviets quickly, Britain's last hope for a major ally would be gone. It turned out to be one of the worst mistakes in military history. This second fateful decision came just 6 months later, half a world away. Japan was expanding its empire, and it desperately needed the resources of Southeast Asia. The only thing standing in its way? The American Pacific Fleet. So, Japan made a choice. launch a surprise knockout blow against the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The human cost was just staggering. Over 3,500 Americans were killed or wounded that morning. Japan's goal was to cripple the U.S. Navy so badly that America would have no choice but to accept Japanese expansion. Well, it had the exact opposite effect. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't break America. It unified it overnight. Isolationism vanished in the smoke. The U.S. immediately declared war on Japan. And then, in a move that still baffles historians, Hitler declared war on the United States just 4 days later. Any line between the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific was now gone. It was one single global struggle. And with America officially in the fight, the final teams were set. That attack had forged a powerful new coalition, all dedicated to one thing: defeating the Axis powers. So now you had two global coalitions facing off. On one side, the Grand Alliance: Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Definitely an odd mix, but a necessary one. They were up against the Axis powers: Germany, Italy, and Japan. And here's the crucial part. The Allies all agreed to demand unconditional surrender. This was a promise that they would fight as one until the absolute end, which meant Hitler could never cut a separate deal to divide them. Now, for the first few years of the war, the Axis powers really did seem unstoppable. But the year 1942, that was the year the tide finally began to turn. A series of massive battles around the world would finally put a stop to the Axis advance. The question on everyone's mind was, after years of defeat and retreat, was it even possible? Could the Allies actually halt the Axis war machine? Well, 1942 was about to give them their answer. 3 gigantic victories in 1942 completely changed the war. First, in the deserts of North Africa, British forces stopped the legendary Desert Fox, General Rommel, at the Battle of El Alamein. Then, on the frozen Eastern Front, the Soviets pulled off the impossible. They surrounded and completely destroyed an entire German army at Stalingrad. This was the turning point in Europe. And out in the vast Pacific, the U.S. Navy delivered a knockout blow at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and establishing American naval superiority for good. That victory at Midway was a total game changer. It allowed the U.S. to finally go on the offensive. And they did it with a really smart strategy called island hopping. Instead of fighting bloody battles for every single Japanese-held island, American forces would capture key islands to use as air bases, and then just bypass the others, cutting them off from supply. It created a direct island-by-island pathway to Japan itself. And this quote from FDR from just a couple of months after Pearl Harbor really says it all. The idea that oceans could protect America, that was gone, forever. Those oceans had become, in his words, endless battlefields. The age of American isolation was over. In its place, a new era of global engagement had been forged in the fires of World War II, a new reality that absolutely continues to shape our world to this very day.